apologies for absence. Peter, anyone?
Councillor Bell has given apologies for lateness, Chair.
Thank you.
Councillor Renison as well, Chair.
Sorry, I missed that.
Councillor Renison as well. I know she's not a member of the committee, but she obviously attends most audit committees, doesn't she?
She did indeed, and she let me know that she's got a local meeting. Yeah, thanks for that. Item 3, declarations of interest. Nope, I'm not hearing any. Minutes of the previous meeting. And I couldn't see any matters arising, Peter, but just remind me, were there any?
Technically, on the minutes of the previous meeting.
Yep, go ahead.
Numbering at the end has gone a bit askew.
Okay.
Yeah, well, we'll put that right. Thank you, Harvey. Any matters arising that members want to raise?
So it's not a matter arising, but just to declare interest that I'm a member of We're Not Blind TMO board. Good.
Yeah, thanks. Right, with that, let's move on to our new order, which brings in item 6 at this stage. Tim, are you going to sort of kick this off?
Start with coming off mute, Chair. Yes, of course. I suppose I should start off with a sort of a slight apology that didn't come to the last Audit Committee meeting. Certainly it was ready, but the agenda was extremely busy, as of course it always is, and seems particularly busy this evening, so I will be swift. So attached is the report for the Audit Committee to note. What I will do, though, however, is paint a tiny bit of context. Members will, of course, be aware that between this being written and this point in time, of course, there has been a restructure of the top tiers of the organisation. And, of course, you will have had that shared with you through various fora and be aware of that from various sets of communication. That has led to an expansion of the Chief Executive Directorate in a number of areas, but that isn't reflected in the current version of the Risk Register. So this will have to be revised, and of course this is taking some time to do, given the substantial changes and given the fact that we are in the middle of a pandemic and other things. So just quickly picking out what's in the report as it's currently shown, and as I say, when we Audit Committee next come back to these, we will hopefully have put them back into the right order. But the presentations this evening from both myself and Ashman will be reflective of the so the first thing that is highlighted in the report was around communications, culture and engagement. Obviously, throughout the last 10 months, 11 months in terms of the pandemic, this particular area has indeed been somewhat stretched. Particular engagement with communities around the pandemic and engagement around a lot of the messaging coming out, of course, from central government, but then to enter local messaging and engaging with local communities has been critical to the success of our work in this area, in particular around the pandemic. But of course, there are other risks within the corporate risk register, which we've spoken about. Again, critical that we're communicating and engaging with our residents, our businesses, and wider communities. So this does feel a little bit out of date, but I hope that members have felt that throughout this particular stretching period over the last 10, 11 months, that these teams have performed in terms of that work. The second area that's highlighted is human resources. And again, throughout the various communications coming out to all the stakeholders throughout this period, you'll be aware of the fact that the human resources team, and in fact working with, of course, all of our staff, has been complex across the organisation, and we have had to work very hard with deployment schemes, staff motivation, and working very hard on keeping people safe, and making sure we can deliver all of those essential services. And certainly, again, that's been challenging. The particular risk highlighted here is around inclusive leadership. And I hope, again, that the various pieces of engagement and communication out to members have continued to highlight the groundbreaking work we're doing in terms of inclusive leadership. Members may have remembered the fact that we had some champions that we put in place, about 30 of those who have been championing inclusive leadership across all of our directorate. That becomes more challenging as more and more of our staff are working remotely, but again, we continue to push on with this work, and the leadership coming out of the Chief Executive's Directorate on this piece. Indeed, that was considered, the next stage of that was considered today as part of the Chief Executive's management team. And one of the next things we're going to be putting in place are inclusive leadership mentors, so that managers can go to those mentors and have open and frank discussions about inclusive leadership. In relation to HR systems, again, I'm sure that there'll be a discussion about the risks around cyber attack later, and I'm sure that'll be covered, but the HR systems haven't been largely affected by that. We've managed to continue to pay our staff, continue to recruit and pay all of our agency staff and maintain that piece, and also our other HR systems are largely unaffected, so ability to monitor sickness and all of those things is largely unaffected, although the reporting on that is not as good as we would like at the moment, but continues to improve. The last area highlighted here is legal, and people will be aware that they may be aware that there's been a restructure in legal, and that's now completed. And this is largely targeting some of the risks that are identified within here, particularly around management of caseloads and focusing on particular high-risk areas of work. So that restructure aims to address some of these risks and strengthen our legal team in that area. Also, the governance team has been doing a lot of work, in particular around modernisation of constitution, again, which some of the members on this on the Audit Committee will be aware of because they're very closely involved in that work. And modernisation of our constitution, and again, that piece of work continues. It's not something that is done and finished, and will continue to run for many months. And of course, there will be changes to our constitution that will be highlighted at council in the coming months. And that will be work that's been closely engaged with a large number of members. And I know, as I say, some of the members on this committee have been engaged in that. I think, Chair, given time, I probably won't say a lot more than that, but coming back to my original point, that these risk registers will move about somewhat in the coming months, given the restructure. But as I say, this evening's presentation will be based on old structures. So Ashman, I know, is on later, and he will cover the area for housing, etc. So I'm happy to pause there and welcome any questions either on something I've said, or if there's anything in terms of that risk register which you may wish to probe on at all, albeit it's a version of some months old now.
You're right, Harvey.
Back to you.
Okay. Any questions for Chief Executive? I'm
Yes, please.
Yep. Michelle.
Hi. Thank you, Tim. That's useful. Just one thing I wanted to raise on the communications and cultural and engagement risk. I wondered if that should be in the red, because I know we do well on some things, but less well on others. And of particular concern recently has been the communications around the LTNs, and how a lot of residents have expressed concerns about the lack of consultation on the implementation, and also communication around COVID. And I say that because I think we had done well, but we haven't been, perhaps we could do something differently or extra in terms of convincing people to behave better and safer, should I say. So I wondered how you felt about that. And there's also a general trend, I think, nationally on a lack of confidence in government, and how in local government, I think there's an onus on us to address that and kind of put in measures to be convince people to have faith in us. And so the example of the LTN and other things that have happened, I think, creates a greater risk of adding to the lack of trust trend that's in place at the moment. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for that, Councillor Gregory. I'll probably take those. The last point you made about lack of confidence in government, I don't think that's probably appropriate for me to comment upon. What I think you're probably trying to get to, which is, we're all aware that there are a number of trusted voices out there, in terms of some voices are trusted more than others in the widest public space. So coming back to the COVID comms, we have throughout the whole period continued to push out communications through Hackney Today, Hackney Life. That has certainly been front and centre in terms of that publication. Working with our local press to try and get out clear messages around all of those things, which is, of course, we come back to those core messages of hands, face and space. Members will not be aware, probably, but Polly Chock, who is our Director of Communications, Consultation, Engagement and Culture, has worked on the Pan-London piece of work that's been produced alongside the Greater London Authority. Her and the Communications Director from Camden worked on that with a group of Communications Directors across London to produce that very useful piece of work. And yes, Councillor Dinch, yes, we also won a Communications Award for some of the communications engagement work we have done. In terms of, we will have gone through a phase, we know, where infections have been high in particular parts of the borough. And obviously infection rates are high across all parts of the borough now and all parts of London. But in particular, producing regular leaflet drops that have been distributed, thousands and thousands of leaflets and direct engagement with particular communities across the borough, with voluntary sector. So I think the COVID comms is probably as best as we could probably do, given where we are. We have continued to reinforce all of those messages with posters, social media, etc. It's almost relentless. In fact, I suspect some of the members are probably fed up with the communications around COVID, as are probably some of the residents. Of course, the Mayor's been very active, and has Councillor Kennedy been very active in this space as well. So I think it's confounding a lot of us as to what else we can do. Bringing in those stakeholders. I know that certainly we've also worked with the Homerton Hospital, and the Chief Executive of Homerton has been putting out messages as well, which have been quite impactful. We've also supported our local GPs as well in terms of messaging, and supported the CCG, buying in support from our communications team. So there has been a huge amount. I'm not convinced that it needs to increase the risk, because people are a bit dumbfounded as to what else we can do. And perhaps what it would be helpful to do is just produce a short note which lists everything we have done. And maybe that'll give reassurance as to what we've covered there. In terms of the LTNs, I'm aware that this is a very hot topic, to put it mildly. And certainly this is not just a hot topic for Hackney, it's been a hot topic for every London borough that's tried to introduce LTNs. And whether that was the Mini Holland scheme within Waltham Forest, or whether it's schemes that are currently being introduced in Islington, Camden and many other places. They are hugely emotive. And we do know that, and we know that when we go into that space, that it's going to be quite tricky. The risk around, I suppose, the introduction of LTNs probably sits more fairly squarely, perhaps not with the comms team, but with the Director of Neighbours and Housing. The comms team in this particular area are, of course, a support function. We have got a dedicated resource that is put alongside the introduction of the LTNs. I don't know whether we're winning or losing the argument on LTNs. I think that, as we say, they're a very hot topic. I think the LTN risk should probably be thought about when you have the discussion with the Neighbours and Housing with Ashman later on the agenda. If there is a need for additional resource to be put into that, it would be supplied if that's requested by that particular area. So I take the point, and I think what it's probably worth doing is maybe updating the risk register for what you could call is a current issues, which is of course COVID, and a forward look on things like LTNs. And then going forwards, there'll be other hot topics that of course come forwards. We do our best as a director to support those particular service areas and implementation, but as I say, these are very, very emotive issues. But I think we're doing our best to try and get those clear messages across. But certainly we can take some of those comments on board.
Great, thanks. Any other members? Yes, Claire, please.
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to ask Tim whether there'd been any other change of risk in any of the other areas in your directorate at all. I mean, you might have partly answered that question, really, but.
So Councillor Potter, thank you for the question. This was the risk register that was struck at the end of September. We're currently in the process of looking at end of December risk. And this was, as I say, discussed at the management team, my management team today, because of course I wear two hats, chief executive and a group director essentially for the chief executive's directorate. So in that hat, we discussed the risk register today. That's in the process of being revised. I think, yes, in answer to your question, some of the things we have to give consideration to at this point in time. One is the ongoing impact of the pandemic and the impact on some of those services. So if I took an example, the Ways into Work team will have to look at and consider the risks of delivering the services, whether they need to change what they're doing, given the levels of unemployment that have unfortunately happened, given the fact that people are coming off furlough, given the impact on the economy, both locally and nationally. So that as an example, yes, of course, we will have to review that risk and think about whether we need to change that. And that this is happening now. And there will be many other examples within this risk register and across the other ones where we need to consider both the impact of, in particular, COVID and the impact on our businesses, our residents, our communities. And think about going forward how we address the impact and some of those risks. And of course, you'll see those things writ large in areas such as education, children's services. So the answer is yes, and we'll be in the process. And I suspect we will have to keep a weather eye on this as the pandemic changes, hopefully for the better. We see it coming out the other end of this.
Good. Anyone else? Can I just then, Tim, just following up on that issue, because the September risk register highlighted the impact of COVID on employment, and particularly in the arts sector, and that has only got worse with the second wave or third wave now. And you've mentioned the Ways into Work team. Given that we've now moved into a higher risk and certainly a deeper downturn than we were expecting, is the scale of our response in that area going to be adequate? And the other issue you highlighted here was the capacity of the voluntary sector to deliver aspects of the community strategy. And again, I'd be interested whether, you know, taking now a January perspective, how you feel about the capacity of the voluntary sector, both in terms of the immediate COVID response, but because it's crucial at the front end, but also the longer term issue that Stephen will be taking in terms of managing that delivery of the community strategy.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Sharman. In terms of the Ways into Work team, they do amazing things, both supporting our graduates, apprenticeships, of course, which we have a very large number, one of the largest numbers of apprenticeships of any London borough. So that's good. That will obviously need to continue, but that's very much internal. The number of referrals they are receiving through from the likes of Job Centre Plus have, of course, gone up. There are also referrals through into private sector organisations that have been procured by Department for Work and Pensions. Again, they have scaled up due to demand over the last few months. I think what we need to consider is, obviously, there is not an infinite amount of money or resource in order to be able to deliver this service, but increasing numbers of people that have been unemployed. Broadly, some people will self-help themselves into work over the coming period, and that's naturally what people do. There are a number of people that have never been out of work and will struggle because they've never experienced being in a benefit system, having to go through a Job Centre Plus, any of those experiences, and we're there to support them, signpost them to places, help them as our revenue to benefits teams and other teams. So we could scale that team up to huge resource in order to deliver, but they have got increased referrals, and at the moment they are doing their best they can with that. But again, it's difficult to know how this is going to settle down longer term. Your question about the voluntary sector, it may be better asked to them. But my reflection is, early on in the pandemic, people will be aware that there were large numbers of people that were shielded. And Hackney Council did an absolutely amazing job supporting those people that were shielding and providing them with food and other assistance, whether it's pharmaceutical deliveries, whatever it may be, but also emotional support and other support. Of course, we went fortunately into a downturn in terms of the impacts of the pandemic throughout the summer period, but of course, unfortunately, it's come back again. What we did in that interim period was we worked very, very closely with the voluntary sector to scale them up to be able to provide that support. And I have to say they have stepped up amazingly in terms of supporting people around pharmaceutical deliveries, around emotional support, around food deliveries, and we have flowed funding into that, of course, to make sure they've got that, but they are doing an absolutely amazing job and working very closely with us on that. So at this point in time, I think the voluntary sector are doing very, very well from the services they are helping us to deliver and delivering directly. In the longer term, of course, there may be an impact and there may be a necessity to increase resources into that area or to think about how we redirect the resources that are going into the voluntary sector. Bearing in mind we have a very large voluntary sector grants programme, which has not been cut despite austerity and has continued to have inflation applied to it. So it is one of the largest voluntary sector grant pots within London, which we make sure we apply well. So I think that it will be a test of time, but at the moment the voluntary sector seems to be standing up well, is my view.
That's helpful. Oh, yeah. As I say, I was really picking it up from this risk report, which indicates it was a given that we have, as you say, put so much into the voluntary sector and hoping that we will be able to act as partners at the front end, cooperation is key if we're going to deliver a broad-based community strategy. So I'm hearing a slightly less concern from you than was indicated by this report. Is that a fair summary?
I think, Chair, we have worked very, very closely with them and worked very, very well with them throughout this pandemic. And I can't say enough in terms of praise for what they've done and how we've worked together. It's been absolutely fantastic.
Great. Okay. Just really following up on Claire's point about, are there any, given your review today, where you'd move at the moment? I think all your indicators are in the yellow, as it were. Are there any that you are now moving into the red as a result of your debate today?
We haven't gone through a full debate today because it's the first time the management team's come together. What I've asked them to do is go away and review it, given the fact that we are in early January and this is the point at which we should be reviewing it. But I've asked them to go away and review it, of course, in the context of COVID. I think what would be probably pushing things up into the red would probably be a demand for services, as opposed to our ability to deliver them. I suspect that demands quite often in things like ways into work do outstrip supply, but I suspect that's going to become more acute given the impact of COVID on the economy, on our residents and on our businesses. And I think one thing that's become evident throughout the pandemic is how local government has stepped into and stepped up throughout this and done an amazing job. And I can't laud not only our staff but local government generally for what they've done. Of course, the NHS as well, but it's been a fantastic response. So yes, I'm sure some would go into red, but that would be purely, I think, because of demand.
Good. Well, that's reassuring. And just to say, I totally agree with your point about local government's response, which I think has been exemplary. And the tragedy is that the government don't seem to know how to use and integrate and support that capacity. It's one of the reflections I think we will have on reviewing this. Tim, just while you're here, I'm just conscious that a lot of the corporate risk, I'm talking to you as chief executive rather than leader of your division. No, we just highlighted there are a lot of them in the red, and some of them we've already had a very good session, as I said, on ICT. And certainly I'm happy to talk through with Ian, particularly on the capital risk for borrowing. One of the ones, and likewise the SEND financing. A couple of the others, though, it would be helpful just to have your overview point. One on the safeguarding board issues, temporary accommodation, which I know Ajman will be able to fill out, and the universal credit points and the unregistered schools. Just some reflections at that level about where you see from your chief executive role the risks and our management of them. Are you able to give me some? So you're on
children or adult safeguarding.
Well, it's the issue is on children in particular, with the Ofsted and COVID pressures, particularly bearing on that, and it's that mixture that takes it into the red.
Sorry, Chair. The second point was
well, the temporary accommodation is
okay.
And I'm just very mindful of the statistic that came out, I think, earlier today of 127,000 children now in temporary accommodation.
And the third, okay, and the third one?
The third one was universal credit, which again, I think there's going to be enormous pressure over the next few months for all the reasons that you've outlined.
Okay. Right. I won't go into a huge amount of detail on those because I suspect actually there are others in the room that will go close to the detail on this. So if I can go, so safeguarding of children, you'll be aware that there is a response to the Ofsted review that happened. We got the result of that just over a year ago, and that there is an action plan that was submitted to Department for Education in relation to that Ofsted inspection. Between myself and Anne Canning, we chair a board that looks at those actions and monitors the progress against those. There is no doubt that the pandemic has had an impact on the progress against some of those recommendations and on the action plan. That's bound to happen. That's the same across many services. But progress has been made against all of those actions and against that action plan. So whilst it might not be quite as quick as we would have hoped, I'm confident that those actions are continuing to be progressed, and both Anne Canning and myself, as I say, as co-chairs of that board, make sure that they are progressing. In terms of risk to children, of course, our social workers continue to do their work. That does become more tricky when you are kind of quite see children as often and as closely as you perhaps like. But of course, all of that work is continuing, and that service, of course, adapts to and considers how it manages risk in terms of young people in the context that we're in, i.e. doing some things virtually and some things at a distance. So I probably won't say any more than that beyond the fact that the action plan is progressing. In terms of universal credit, well, of course, there are a much larger number of people gone onto universal credit as a result of the impact on the economy. Ian may be better. Ian's closer to the detail on UC and the interaction with his revenues and benefits team, so he may be able to say a bit more on that. In terms of temporary accommodation, this, of course, has been an issue that has been a hot topic and has been live for a number of years. And this is particularly stark within London. And we know that there are large numbers of people in temporary accommodation across the country, but in particular in London because of the impacts of the cost of housing. And many of those, of course, are families. It is something that there isn't a simple answer to, beyond building more and more homes. Of course, we know that that is both not been happening, but is, of course, slowed throughout a pandemic. So Ian may have more numbers and detail it to hand, but I probably won't say more than that. But of course, highlighting those risks, I don't disagree with any of them, but we have to continue to try and do our best with them within the context we're currently working in. Ian, I don't know if
it's helpful, Chair, I can just give some quick numbers, but I'm more than happy to pick up specific questions in greater detail when we come to the corporate risk item, on the basis that we've always got Ajman and his team.
Absolutely. And I don't want to go into the detail. What I wanted was the reassurance from Tim's overview, as it were, that the council has the capacity to deal with and is taking these key risks. And that's the reassurance that you.
Of course, Chair, and we continue to. The teams that are working in these areas, again, I can't praise them enough. The work that we've done around rough sleepers and putting those up into accommodation within hotels, the work that's been done to keep them safe, healthy, and looked after has been simply amazing. The work that our social workers continue to do with young people, again, is absolutely fantastic, and supporting those people moving on to universal credit and helping them, signposting them, making clear where they can get support and access to the support they need. I can't say enough in praise of those teams that support those people. It's been fantastic.
Put some context into the scale on the UC numbers. Before the pandemic, we had just under 14,000 in the borough on UC. We're now running at 32,000. So you can see the sort of order of magnitude. I mean, between April and May, we saw 9,000 additional people going to UC, just as an example. So big numbers.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I was picking these numbers, and the worry about the evictions, for example, adding to our temporary accommodation, or the possible evictions when the security runs out of tenancies, the UC point, and the jobs that you've talked about, Tim. All of these are real worries and are going to intensify over the next few months. What I was really looking forward was that we are confident in our ability to deal with that coming pressures. Okay, any final points for Tim before we? Yeah, Harvey, you're on mute.
Sorry, yeah. Firstly, really last, what you just said about evictions and protection from them, I think we all have to take note of what the government's done in extending the protection, but in that extension, they've left a huge loop. It seems they left a huge loophole in that they are not taking into account the time that people have had difficulty paying under the pandemic as they were previously. So now if people have run up arrears during the pandemic, those will actually be allowed to be taken into account in terms of evictions, which is, I had to mention it, it's crazy. It has to be changed. First thing I wanted to say really, it's actually nothing to do with the risk register, it's overall meeting logistics. I'm using the printed version of the agenda, and I don't know whether it was a deliberate decision or whether it was a difficulty due to the problems we've had with printing because of the cyber attack, or whether it's just an oversight, but there's no page numbering and it's making it very, very difficult to go through the agenda without any page numbering at all. And for whatever reason, we need to reverse that. But that's the logistical thing, as I said. The one thing I really wanted to ask about is, I know that the risks of the cyber attack belong under the corporate risk register, but I'm wondering why there's no reference to it whatsoever in the chief executive, in the strategic risk register, because I would have thought, because of the scale of it, it would be something that would come, that should be at least referenced in the strategic risk register. Or am I completely wrong, or have I misread it and not seen that it's there?
Well, it is under the corporate risk register, and we had that assessment earlier.
Oh yeah, I know that. I'm just wondering why there's no reference to it in the strategic risk register. Not that we would want to go into it now because we've had the briefing, but I would have thought something that would be cross-referenced because of the scale of it, of the risk.
Matt, do you want to come in there?
Because
Ian, can you come in on that?
I think very simply, if I've understood the question correctly, the reason it's not in the chief executive's risk register is because ICT and the associated risks sit within finance and resources, so it would be in that risk register, if that makes sense from the directorate perspective. But obviously, given the scale of it, it elevates itself to the corporate risk register, where we bring together the risks we see as being of a corporate nature. So if you want to add to that, Matt?
Sorry, Chair, it's a bit simpler than that. The Chief Executive's risk register was missed a cycle of meetings because it was so busy. This is the Chief Executive's risk register as at the 30th of September, and the cyber attack hadn't happened. And that's why it's reflected on the corporate risk, where of course it will be on the Chief Executive's one next time. That's why it's on the corporate one, because it's a slightly later date.
Okay. Anyone else coming in? No, I'm not seeing any. Great. Well, Tim, thank you. Can I first of all endorse what you said about the staff? I think we've all been very proud of being part of Hackney and its response over the last few months, and your leadership of that, I think, takes a lot of the credit for that. And I guess a personal thanks to you for having led Hackney successfully for so many years. So since this is likely to be your swan song to this committee anyway, I think we should record our thanks and hope for your future retirement at ease, if not without activities. I'm sure it will be.
Yeah, I don't know if there's many other councillors that can remember the turmoil in terms of changes of leadership before Tim became chief executive.
So thank you, Chair. I am part of the leadership team. I can't do it without everyone else. So it's a big team effort, and whilst I might be chief executive, I simply can't do it without the rest of my management team and without the rest of those leaders. So thank you for that.
Well said, and of course we appreciate that. But you have led it and represented it, so I think my remarks stand or acknowledging that. Okay.
Can I add to that, Councillor Sharman, just to say that I am so impressed with the quality of the work of the people who work in local government at Hackney Council. So just, I just reiterate, it is such a high standard. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Oh yeah, claps all round. All right. Can we then move on to the next item, which is, our rejigged agenda goes to Ashram, to the risk register for neighbourhoods and housing.
Thank you, Councillor Sharman. Good evening, everybody. Can I just point out and echo what Tim said at the beginning of his presentation, in that there's a couple of areas missing from the neighbourhoods and housing risk register because they are no longer in the team. They moved on as part of the restructure, and that is around the regeneration, libraries and private sector housing. So they've moved out now, so they're not reflected in this risk register. So that said, we've got 11 risks in our register, 3 of which are also reflected in the corporate risk register, and my directorate leadership team reviewed all of these just before Christmas. So the ones around climate emergency, fire safety and contract procurement and management, they're also reflected in the corporate risk register. And we've got some important new registers in the neighbourhoods and housing one, which weren't reflected previously. And one of them is around the pandemic, which you've heard Tim talk about. And this directorate has played a significant role together with the rest of the council in terms of making sure that services continue to be provided throughout the pandemic, whether directly staff coming into the office and into Hackney or working from home. So, for example, all our environmental services have by and large been provided throughout the whole of the pandemic without any issues. Bin services, refuse cleansing, street cleansing, grounds maintenance, all our parks, etc. They've all been provided, they've all been open throughout that pandemic in very difficult circumstances, and the staff have done a fantastic job around that. In terms of the other risks that weren't previously on is around the pressure on budgets and income streams, and that's been largely as a result of the pandemic. So we've lost quite a lot of income both within the HRA and the general fund. So forecast income loss in the HRA is expected to be over £1 million from a combination of areas around tenant service charges, commercial income, service charges for facilities. Rent arrears, they've gone up significantly, and if I was a betting man, I'd probably say they'd land around the £10 million mark by the end of this financial year. So that's been a significant impact as a result of the pandemic, and that hasn't been helped by the cyber attack in terms of our ability to be able to chase arrears for people that are in difficulties. Now, in the general fund, we forecast to have a significant income loss of around 10 million plus from a whole range of different areas, including things like parking, loss in income from commercial waste, particularly where businesses have had to shut down during the pandemic, our markets operation, street scene, and our inability to be able to continue to provide events in our parks and throughout the borough, fixed penalty notices around community safety. So a whole bunch of areas where there's been a loss of income as a result of the pandemic. So that's been quite challenging, and hopefully some of that will be recouped as we come out of the pandemic, but some of it will not return, and so we'll need to make sure we've got some additional resources to be able to cover things like bad debt. know it's on the agenda a bit later on in terms of the capital projects, so I'll not dwell too much on that, but we've continued to try and provide as many of the capital projects as we possibly can, both in housing and in the general fund. But some of it has slowed down as a result of the pandemic and as a result of contractors taking their own steps to, as a result of not getting staff and having to shut down, particularly at the beginning of the first lockdown, although it's been continuing more recently. But nevertheless, it has had an impact on our capital programme. I think the other risk that we put into our neighbourhoods and housing risk strategy, which wasn't in previously, was around our resilience and emergency planning. So the whole resilience team in Stoke Newington is part of neighbourhoods and housing, and they've done a fantastic job in terms of supporting the broader council around both setting up the testing centres and managing those and supporting the rest of the team throughout the pandemic over the last 9 months. And also continue to make sure that they are, prepared for any other emergencies that might arise, making sure that the business continuity plans are in place to continue with services. And we probably couldn't have planned this, could we? Both having the pandemic and then followed by the cyber attack. So it was a double whammy. So I just wonder what the next one might be. Hopefully nothing to have gone over this hurdle. But they also have done a fantastic job for providing that support. We've got ICT and cyber in our risk assessment here as well, because a lot of services, neighbourhoods and housing, particularly around housing services, rely on good IT infrastructure, and so they have had an impact. We have tried to provide those services as best we can under the circumstances, but that has caused some difficulties, and no doubt you'll all be aware of the difficulties that it's caused around the property market in terms of not being able to provide full land charge services as a result of the cyber attack. So I don't really want to say too much in relation to that because of the ongoing investigation around that. Nevertheless, I think the staff have done a fantastic job in trying to provide services, have workarounds despite those challenges that we face around IT. So they're the 5 newer risk areas that fare in our neighbourhoods and housing risk register that weren't previously in there. What else can I say? So the climate emergency I mentioned, staff retention, and the other one is around customer services. So I think, despite our best endeavours, there will be some impact on performance and on customer services as a result of that. And I won't shy away from sort of admitting that. But what we do need to make sure is that as we continue to provide services as best as we possibly can, and make sure we're supporting our staff and supporting particularly vulnerable residents in our borough with some of those essential services that neighbourhoods and housing provides. So there are 4 risks that are in the lower end of the red zone, if I can use that term, and that's around the delivery of capital projects, the budget pressures that I mentioned already, the ICT, and the pandemic. So there's sort of the ones in the red area. All the other ones are in the amber. So we've got a detailed plan you'll see from the register in terms of mitigating action that we're taking, and we'll review and monitor those on a regular basis throughout the rest of the year to make sure that we track those and take appropriate action. I think that's about all I've got to say on the neighbourhoods and housing one, Chair.
Yep, no, very helpful. Thank you very much. Colleagues, any points to Ajman that you want to raise? Claire, you got your hand up. I don't know whether that's a memorial. Right, it was.
Yeah, sorry about that, yeah.
So, anyone got any questions? Yeah, I've got 2.
Yes, please.
Yeah, Michelle and then Anna.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashman. Thank you, Ajman, for the report. That's useful. I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about the financial risks. So presumably next year there'll be various increases, etc. But to what extent would you say that there's people who won't be able to meet likely increases next year? So have you designed the budget so that the people who can afford to meet those costs will in effect cross-subsidise the people who won't be able to meet the increases? How are you going to mitigate if there's that much debt at the moment? how are you going to, have you factored that in when considering the finances for next year? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gregg. If you're referring to the rent, that is something that obviously we've got procedures in place to support residents who might have experiencing difficulty in paying their housing rent, for example. And you've already heard the number of people that are claiming more benefits, and we still haven't got the full details because of the cyber in terms of what the level of arrears will be at the end of this. But we've got staff available to provide support to residents to make sure that they can make the necessary applications for benefits and maximise income as much as they possibly can. You talked about evictions previously, and we've not taken any action, and we're not intending to take any action around that. But we will obviously try and make sure that we support and encourage people to pay their rent as much as they can, and any increases will be in line with inflation, and that sort of report will be going to Cabinet in January, setting out what the rental increases will be. In terms of some of the other,
I'm thinking of people who aren't claiming benefits but are on a low income, particularly.
So if they're on a low income, one of the things is how Hackney's housing rent is one of the lowest in London, and we're not proposing to increase that by any more than what we're able to allow, which is CPI plus 1% inflation. So we'll keep it low as possible. We'll support residents if they are in difficulty, and that's the approach that we're going to be taking to make sure that people can pay. And as I say, we won't be taking evasive action as long as we can come to some agreement with residents.
Okay, Anna.
Thanks, Chair. It's just probably echoing the praise that members have already done to Tim, but I think Ajman, your team has particularly been out there, staff particularly taking risks as well. They've had to do that client-facing work, and also I know that many people have fed back about how supportive your team have been in terms of them and their ability to sort of be redeployed into new roles, like calling residents and offering that support to some of our most vulnerable. So I just wanted to extend thanks to you and your teams, because I think we all echo what's been said previously, but it's been really I feel quite privileged actually to be a member of Hackney Councillor, because it's been so great what the teams have all done. So thank you, Ajman, and I hope you're keeping well as well.
Thank you.
All right, Patrick. You're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, I wanted to come back to the question about the rent arrears, because it seems to me that jumps out as a very significant, if not the most significant, of the immediate risks within the directorate. And you said that you're anticipating perhaps 10 million by the end of the financial year. I was trying to find on my mobile, looking at the papers, if there was a theory, what the projection had been before the pandemic, and I don't know if you can quickly answer that. But my main concern is how we get to grips with pressing down on those arrears. If I was sort of playing devil's advocate, I would say that yes, you've got people going onto universal credit because they're losing their jobs, tenants going onto universal credit. But under universal credit, they should be able to obviously apply to get the housing element. There may be a delay in getting the housing element, but again, that should be backdated, hopefully, for most people. And so there is a case to be said that a lot of those arrears are ones which should resolve themselves, because most tenants should be able to get payment either through universal credit or obviously through their other income through work to continue to pay their weekly social rent. And yes, it's important that we are understanding about people's circumstances. On the other hand, it's a contract, isn't it, between the tenant and the council, and there's a contractual obligation placed on the tenant to pay the weekly rent. It seems to me we have to be quite robust, and I hope we are being robust with tenants who can afford to pay, to make sure that they do, because as it builds up, and as you know, at some point the council will have to take legal action, and all the costs that flow from that, and the ultimate risk of eviction, and the costs that flow from that again onto the council and onto other services. So that was my general point, just to say that I hope we do have a very robust plan to tackle the arrears in a proactive fashion, and to emphasise to tenants that they do have a legal responsibility to pay the rent, as much as we want to be supportive in enabling them to manage that.
Great, thank you, Patrick. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, either you or Deirdre. I see you're on as well. Did you want to raise a point around this?
I think
Sorry,
I
I did.
just-
Go on, Deirdre.
Sorry, that was my fault trying to introduce two people.
I just wanted to just to state that as part of the forecast for this year, we've set aside additional resources for the bad debt provision, and we have increased the bad debt provision in the budget next year. So we are recognising the financial impact of the increase in arrears. And I think the issue about tenants paying arrears, obviously we have a corporate debt policy, a vulnerable persons policy, because some of these people moving on to universal credit have always had that. A lot of people that have a change of circumstances and move on to universal credit, the rent has always been paid directly, and there is an issue about, a decision: do you buy food or do you pay rent? It's a difficult one. So it's not just, yes, people, there is a contract and we do chase vigorously, but there is a recognition there are vulnerable people out there, and if you evict somebody with children, they just turn around and turn up in the as a homeless person. That needs to be, but we have a duty to, for the children's sake and things like that.
No, an important debate that I'm sure is going to carry on, because arguments very clearly on both sides. Claire, you wanted to come in.
Thank you, Chair. My question was just about staff, in terms of morale, really, the risk of low staff morale, I suppose, both in terms of the pandemic, where you have obviously staff absences, which affects the services that you can deliver, but also I noticed you had an amber risk for staff retention and recruitment to certain roles. So I just wondered whether you wanted to comment on that and, the impact it's having on different services.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Potter. I mean, it's really important about the morale and staff well-being, and as a council corporately, we've tried to do as much as we can in terms of supporting staff and acknowledging the efforts that they make, and make sure that they've got access to any services, appropriate services that they might want if they are having difficulties. So we have been very supportive with staff, and sickness levels, aside from the pandemic and people self-isolating and so on, has not been as bad as we might have expected in terms of compared to previous years. So it's been reasonably stable, if I can say that. We've also got a very generous policy in terms of allowing people to have additional leave if they've got responsibilities that they need to fulfill at home. So it's very generous in terms of giving additional leave to staff. In terms of staff retention, there are certain roles that we have sometimes difficulty in filling. For example, at the moment we've had difficulties in filling civil enforcement officers roles, for example, or in the housing world, quantity surveyors or project managers or people in the construction side, which has been quite difficult. So what we need to do is make sure, A, we can try and grow our own where we possibly can. That's really important. But also making sure that we've got good employment policies and attraction policies that will ensure that people can find Hackney as an attractive place. And I know Polly in organisation development has been doing quite a lot of work in terms of trying to sort of ensure that does happen. And again, the issue around workforce development is also on the corporate risk register.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm not seeing any other indications. I just really wanted to highlight the 2 points, or two of the risks, which I think Deirdre is partly, one of which Deirdre is partly answered. One is the reconciliation between budget pressures on the one hand that you've highlighted, Ajman, and the positive prognosis we've had in looking at the HRA budget, which is basically we can accommodate the pressures over the next year without breaking either the HRA budget or the general fund budget. And there just seemed a bit of a disconnect between a high red and saying, well, actually things are looking okay. But I think what you're saying, if I can summarise, is from Deirdre's point, that you've put aside enough that you think will cover that the conflicting pressures you've talked about, and we can accommodate. That was one point. The other point was the capital delivery point. And obviously we're going to come on to talk about the deep dive and getting the improvement in capital prediction, and we can run into a period where it's become doubly difficult. But I think that actually indicates the need to really keep on top of capital delivery and have some really good realistic estimates that we can hold to. On that, I was just going to suggest we will come back to it on our capital budget reviews, but that's certainly something I'm very anxious that we keep an eye on over the next few months. Okay, any other points? Let's move on. Thanks very much, Ajman, for your contribution. And let's move on to, I tell you, it's the corporate register now in our rejigged budget.
I'm happy to do that, or whether you want us to do the finance update just to give an overview.
I'm easy, whichever you.
Okay. Yeah, cool. We'll give a quick overview of the finances, and then I was going to suggest that Jackie will take us through the deep dive capital paper, and then we can do corporate risk and performance stats update. Does that seem to work? Great stuff. I'll just get the slides up on screen. Once I have how to do it. There we go. Hopefully people can see the slides on screen. Is that okay? I can see some thumbs up now. Right. That's all great stuff. Okay, so just a very quick update, building upon the many updates we've done to Audit Committee and the sort of scrutiny audit group on where we are with the budget and other sessions we've held with members. We're obviously now very much, aren't we, at the sort of last knockings of the budget setting process for 21-22, and sort of, you know, bringing the final touches together of where we end up with not just housing revenue account budget, which the paper's going through to Cabinet this month, but also the general fund budget as well. It's probably fair to say, isn't it, there's been unprecedented times to bring together budget proposals, not just for future years, but also bring forward proposals in relation to the current year. So just quickly give you an update on the position there. Obviously, you'll recall the challenges that were faced at the outset of the pandemic, and in particular the forecasts we were making around the significant shortfalls that we were experiencing and anticipating in the absence then of any clarity about any funding we would receive from government. What is pleasing to see is that through a combination of measures, through firstly further drilling down and control on our revenue budgets, review of our revenue contributions to capital and things that are genuine within our control, as well as always great budget management by respective budget holders. Once we now start to apply the emergency monies we were allocated by the government, so if you just by way of reminder, we received 4 tranches of funding, all distributed in slightly different ways, and we were also able to start to apply for what's called the sales fees and charges compensation scheme. So again, we've submitted our second return for that just before Christmas, and certainly the returns we're submitting are all again being received by government. We've received the money for the first return, and we're expecting to receive the monies for the second return. Not yet had any queries back on what we've submitted. Basically, what we have to submit there is data for what we feel we've lost in terms of the impact of COVID on various sales fees and charges, not including commercial property, I would add. And then subject to me being satisfied what the return is and certifying it. Government does have the opportunity to come, or officials have the opportunity to come and ask questions, but they haven't asked any questions of us yet, so that's reassuring. That then takes us down to what I'd call overall gaps, and at the moment we're forecasting a gap on the general fund of just under £3 million. So certainly within the orders of magnitude that are manageable, but not ones with which we will be complacent. Turning to they can see we're continuing to work hard on that forecast, but as I say, teams need to now bear in mind the fact that as we enter the third lockdown, we're just conscious that the figures will invariably change, and certainly discussions are taking place with officials in the ministry around whether any further support will come forwards to councils. As you know, as part of the settlement that was announced just before Christmas, there was a recognition that councils would be able to apply for loss of income for the first quarter of next financial year as well. On the basis of the paper later on the agenda around capital deep dive, Jackie and I are very keen to make sure we included an update on spend as at where we are in the current financial year. So you can see there a quick summary of by directorate and where we are in terms of Q3 capital programme and spend, and obviously that's something which is working its way through. Councillor Sharman, you're absolutely right that it is unprecedented times we're operating in for delivering capital schemes, particularly in the lockdown period. Obviously the biggest scheme the council's got ongoing at the moment is one we're all very much looking forward to seeing open, I'm sure, which is the Britannia Leisure Centre and City of London Academy down in Shoreditch. Massive schemes that are being delivered. I had an update only this morning from the team about progress there, and they are continuing to deliver that scheme, but are experiencing some challenges as well. I think full credit to the project team, and in particular developer Morgan Sindel, who've put in place making sure their workforce is looked after, regular testing of the workforce, to make sure again that health and safety of the workforce is paramount. But our expectation is that scheme is still subject to nothing material changing over the next month or two, on track to deliver around the summertime of what we originally anticipated, which is pretty much unprecedented, I think, for a scheme of that scale in the context of what we've been working to. Update on post-spending review and local government settlement. So we had the spending review and update just before Christmas, and members will recall we were forecasting then a gap of around £11 million. At that point, it was based upon a council tax increase in the round of 4%, of just under 4%, 3.99. We've been undertaking work to conclude the closing of that gap, and been developing with members combination of directorate savings proposals and opportunities to utilise some of the special COVID funding that was announced as part of the settlement, and also having regard to the need to make provision for costs arising from the cyber attack. We had a useful session with scrutiny chairs, audit chair, back in December to go through the latest directorate proposals, and detailed proposals were presented by lead members, group directors, and these were scrutinised intensely by members. Some further work was undertaken, and members are now taking forwards proposals around what we classified there as green and amber savings for the coming financial year. In the spending review or the settlement, government announced that councils will be able to actually increase council tax by up to 5%. So in relation to an authority like ours providing social care services, that gives us the opportunity to raise an adult social care precept not 2%, but actually by 3%, and core council tax by 1.99, giving us an overall potential total increase of 4.99 compared to what we'd been budgeting for at that 3.99. The team have been undertaking detailed modelling options for the executive, as you'd expect, and also having regard to the Mayor of London's proposals around the GLA precept, and those options are now being considered and developed and will be published publicly in due course, as you'd always expect as part of the budget setting process. And we will be doing updates, I'm sure, at the scrutiny panel and other places as well. Alongside this, real recognition, picking up on your point, Councillor Sharman, about universal credit and the pressures on temporary accommodation. I think government, due to a lot of lobbying, particularly by our Mayor and Cabinet Member of Finance, recognise the pressures that are on residents in terms of paying not just council tax but all sorts of bills. And as part of the spending review settlement, we were allocated £3.4 million to enable us to put in place further schemes to support residents experiencing difficulty paying council tax. And again, we've been working up a number of options about how we deploy that money. We do have more flexibility than we had for the hardship fund monies that were given to us as part of the current financial year, where we were allocated just over £4.5 million, and we're basically mandated to apply £150 basically discount to those people in receipt of council tax reduction from their bills in a rather arbitrary way. I think we'll come up with a scheme that's more targeted at where need is most great. Turning to the budget timeline, again, you can see things that have happened so far. Big report on the agenda, which I'm sure will be a highlight of the council meeting in January, which is our council tax base report to full council. And say we're just putting the final touches to that report. Quite difficult this year, given all the uncertainties, particularly around business rates, business rate release. Will they continue? Will they not? But again, we'll set out fully all the assumptions and the basis on which judgments have been landed out there to enable us to move to the next stage of the budget, which of course is full council on the 24th of February. And then beyond that, we'll look to start progress. Well, and in fact, we've already started some work on budget planning for 22-23, because I think, you know, the challenge never stops, does it? I don't think any of us are under any expectation that the financial challenges councils face are going to get any easier in the short term, potentially in the medium term. And you know, again, that's something me and the team are looking forward to just getting cracking on with, to make sure that we're as well placed as we can be to make sure we protect our financial position. So that was all the slides we had there. Happy to pause for questions, and then maybe Jackie takes us through the capital deep dive report.
Yep. Great. Well, thanks very much. Very useful summary of where we are, and quite reassuring. We're still on our basic trajectory that we've been talking about for the last few months. And your point about needing to keep an overview of this budget, even once we settle this, the next year's budget. And I've proposing to meet Rebecca just to think about how we take the overview initiative that I think has been useful in this process, take it forward. Okay, any questions to Ian? I'm not seeing any hands. So great, thanks very much, Ian. That reassuring report. Jackie, do you want to summarise where we got to on the deep dive?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just a word of warning, my internet keeps dropping out, but hopefully it won't during the next few minutes. So on the agenda tonight, there was a summary of the work that was undertaken as part of the deep dive review. So just to refresh, the Audit Committee led a piece of work during the latter part of the last calendar year. And the reason this piece of work came about was because, as we reported through the last year or so, there remains considerable reprofiling which happens around the capital projects. So effectively, project managers anticipating that they will spend more in the year than they end up doing, and the programme slip into the following year. And I know the committee was concerned, particularly when we look at the Treasury Management Strategy later on in the agenda. We need to be more accurate in terms of capital forecasting before we're managing our cash balances and borrowing effectively. So that was just a bit of a background to the review. As the members of the committee will know, the deep dive review considered a number of pieces of evidence, including looking at the current capital monitoring processes, reviewing comparative information from other London boroughs. I've anonymised it in this report here, actually, because although we did take it off the public domain, I thought it would be helpful just to keep it a little bit more discreet in this report. And what we saw from that is that the challenge was quite a common one in terms of reprofiling, but that's not to underestimate its significance for Hackney. The committee also looked at the detailed outturn reports in relation to 1920 as the last complete year, and how the forecasts have slipped throughout that year, and identified some areas where they wanted to go into more detail with the department managers. And those managers attended the second of the deep dive committee reviews and gave evidence to the committee in terms of what they had, why slippage had occurred. Some of those, and I think it was clear that some of those reasons were more understandable than others, but there was clearly a commitment from those directors to more robustly scrutinise and challenge those forecasts that were coming through from project managers, because there were areas where slippage and optimum bias could be minimised. At the end of the last committee deep dive, I know Chair, you was very keen that the departments reflected on what they presented to the committee and go back and look at how they could improve their processes. And I passed it on to those managers, and they came back with their areas of improvement, but also we encouraged them to make sure they emphasised areas where they thought the corporate teams could improve in terms of corporate capital monitoring and capital forecasting. And those areas are set out in that report. I would say that one of the things that the chair has raised is around the setting of targets for capital monitoring and capital profiling, and we are taking that up while we undertake the capital budget setting for 21-22. But I would say we need to be very careful how we do it, because there are some areas where there is slippage, which is it's not really slippage, it's budget reductions which are favourable. For example, if we go out to a tender for a project and it comes back less than we estimated, and that's a positive thing. And what we don't want to do is obviously introduce any perverse incentives to meet a capital target. That is all I want to say, really. So if anyone's got any questions.
Great, thanks very much. I mean, I thought the session we had with the departmental heads was actually very helpful, in the sense that people were very open about where they thought they could improve things, but within the context of we're dealing with a very uncertain time, a very uncertain area that is always looking forward. I think we understand that. But I thought what was good is that departments recognised that they could do more and that they had plans to do it. And I think making that commitment and then ensuring that they actually do that should be the next stage of that. But taking your point that numbers themselves are not the issue, though it's actually how well we are performing in terms of a changing world. So any points? Because I thought this was basically a good report, which I was happy with. But if any members have got any questions about it, please do raise. And I'm taking. Oh, yep. No, Anna, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just pleased to hear, Jackie, about the support for project managers and the focus around when people are setting milestones, about how they need to be probably a little bit more realistic. Because I think that came out when we met before, wasn't it? That there's sort of some of the times where things have slipped is because maybe they needed a bit more support around setting sort of projects and timelines and sort of having maybe more effective risk registers as well for their projects as well, just to support that whole process. Is there support generally for sort of general projects within the council? Like, do you have like a central PMO or anything?
At the moment, the projects are run from the directorates, but one of the things as part of the chief executive structure, there has been a movement sort of towards a more corporate delivery of some of the larger capital schemes. And although that hasn't happened as yet, because the restructure is still working through its process, that should help to provide a more sort of robust, almost a peer network of support for those project managers. And I think as well, one of the things that we're doing at the moment is we're doing a full-scale capital management review in light of those changes, and in light of the fact that our capital projects going forward are quite significant and potentially reliant on borrowing. And one of the things that will come out of that once we get to the end of that review is making sure that there's a robust and consistent training program for those project managers, so that they're aware of expectations.
No, very helpful. Deirdre, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that in some departments, particularly the big ones with the planned preventative maintenance function, so the planned asset management team within housing services, they have their own team delivering, and I think there are teams of services within services delivering where there are big planned maintenance programs. And obviously the capital management review will consider whether or not that it makes sense for maintenance, ongoing maintenance, and it stays within departments. And the bigger projects are managed corporately.
Thanks for that, Deirdre. Yeah, very, very good point. Can I, if there are no other points, one, I think, to approve the report as our the result of our deep dive. Secondly, we talked about setting targets and a program of action. And Jackie, you were going to come back with some of those commitments perhaps at the next meeting, so that we've got some sort of performance overview of what people are doing. And thirdly, of course, we will receive regular reports on capital as part of our regular performance reporting. So we'll be able to keep an eye on people through the year as well. But it's what you've offered, and I think it's very helpful, is these specific commitments in each department, which we can just be reassured that there's something underneath this plan in terms of implementation.
Yeah, that's fine, Chair.
Yeah. Okay, with those additions, are people happy to approve this? Yep. Okay, great. Let's move on then. Ian, you want to take us to corporate now?
Yes, thank you very much for that, Chair. Obviously, we've got Matt on the call, who, as you know, does all the hard work in relation to getting these papers together for us, and particularly the paper we've got this evening on the corporate risk register. I think is probably one of the most comprehensive updates on the corporate risk register we've had for a while. I think Ajman, I know, is still on the call. We had a detailed session on the corporate risk register at the corporate management team, as we do always, in relation to its timescales before it comes to audit committee. And there was also an update at Cabinet HMT only last week on the paper. So this paper has certainly been very well reviewed by the stakeholders you would expect it to be. But what you've got here today is a paper that summarises in particular main changes from what we brought to the meeting in June, and there no surprises are there that cyber attack is first front and centre, the pandemic, but there's a whole range of other risks set out there. So if it's okay with you, Chair, maybe I've asked Matt just to take us through some of these and then we move on to questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Indeed. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, just a quick summary. So as Ian said, this was signed off by HMT in mid-December. However, since then, even though obviously only a few weeks ago, the situations described in parts of the register have changed quite significantly. Clearly, the risks associated with Brexit have reduced as a result of the deal agreed just before Christmas. Since Christmas, the situation regarding the pandemic has obviously further deteriorated with the third lockdown and worsening statistics, creating further damaging impacts and risks both in the short and medium term. And of course, the ongoing effects of COVID can be seen throughout this register, whether we're looking at the financial risks or areas relating to temporary accommodation, workforce, universal credit. Sadly, its impacts are being felt throughout. It goes without saying that the cyber attack has had a massive impact on risks all over the council. You'll see the first risk in this latest iteration relates to further risks emanating from the cyber attack. Our increased vulnerabilities from this invite further risks, which are detailed in this first risk, and all this results from very careful analysis from Rob and his ICT management team. We had lots of risk-related meetings about this in the immediate aftermath in October, November, and obviously this is ongoing. The unfortunate news last week about some data being published has obviously come after this register was signed off. But the fact that this happens emphasises the severity of the risks and indeed the importance of the ongoing controls. Clearly, as Ian said, there is considerable detail in this register, and these are tumultuous times. So obviously, I imagine there are some further questions from within the content. So happy to answer those.
Very good. Yeah, can I first of all say I think it is. I mean, it's quite a development of the report compared to our previous one. So thanks for that. I found it very helpful, particularly as we've got so many risks really deep into the red here, and as you say, confronting even more uncertainty. So I found it a well worthwhile report to have done. So the management team has got that overview. Any questions from members on Matt's report?
No, I think I asked all my questions earlier in other sections. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that, Michelle. I mean, ICT we've covered, capital risk we've covered in terms of becoming a net borrower, and we'll come back to that in treasury management. Safeguarding board, Tim talked about, and it is a real concern. Send, I'm assuming, Ian, that we have no worse position on send than we had when we reviewed the budget at the end of last year. There's that the unregistered schools was clearly a continuing risk, and presumably that's got worse as a result of COVID. And then the temporary accommodation we covered earlier. I don't know if there's anything Ajman and or Ian want to raise about temporary accommodation, because the real concern, as Deirdre was saying, sort of feedback loop. If people get thrown out, they come back at us another way, and with devastating effect on families. And I think that's what the LGA report of yesterday really brings out.
I mean, if I just take the temporary accommodation one quickly, Chair, I think the point you make is well made, and one we're very aware of. And I think it's exactly why we've set up with Deputy Mayor Ennison, work closely with Councillor Mackenzie and officers, that one approach to council debt, to make sure that we don't end up doing things that lead to usually more expensive, unintended, unhelpful consequences. So actually, Ajman and his team who collect rent actually do an awful lot of work to engage with people who are struggling to pay, looking to make sure that people don't just let the problem accrue substantially, getting people onto payments. Yes, it's been difficult in COVID, but that's the sort of approach we do, and extensive investment went into that team, not in just the last budget round, but in previous ones as well. And again, the proposals going forwards this year look to reinforce that. So would echo it. I know members have had a number of all-member briefings on the challenges that are faced by the temporary accommodation team, stroke housing needs team, and the work that certainly Jennifer Winter leads on. And again, there's work continually in play to increase capacity. I know that we've taken forwards and have further proposals coming forwards in future papers in relation to the overall financial position, where we will be utilising the resources we earmarked to buy back right to buy properties, as an example, again increasing that supply. You can see in this paper the risk on temporary accommodation highlights the fact that we're looking to expand some capacity around hostels as well in the current financial year, building upon great work that's been done so far to try and increase capacity. But ultimately it is a real challenge, but it's one we're certainly working hard to do as much as we can to deal with it, recognising the limitations of what we can ultimately do.
Great. Okay, thanks for that. I'm not seeing any other questions on the overall corporate risk, so shall we move on to the performance issues? That's more everyday performance, as it were. And I don't know, were you going to do it, Ian, or lead off, or was Bruce going to come in?
I think if I just do a very quick introduction. Obviously, in normal times, we bring forwards, as part of the risk paper, the suite of indicators, for want of a better word, that we developed with this committee to give us a sense of the corporate council-wide health, including things about not just financial performance, but issues in terms of workforce, those key visible indicators that residents ultimately rate a council by. Are the streets clean? Are the bins collected? As well as the indicators around the aspects of social care, to give us that sort of snapshot. And I think that's been a real sort of powerful initiative that this committee's led on now for a good few years. Obviously, the cyber attacks impacted upon our ability to do that in its entirety, but what Bruce will talk you through in a moment is what we can do at this stage, and what we're continuing to do, and the sorts of workarounds that we're putting in place where we've had some challenges with the system affected by the cyber attack. So Bruce, do you want to give a quick update?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. We have got data up till the end of September, and I'm happy to share that with the committee by Peter if that's helpful after in sort of the normal format. But obviously, as Ian said, there's gaps now going forward. There's some data that we can continue to collect, and we are in the process of working through with services as they rebuild and reconstruct what data we can get that is either the same as or a proxy for that basket of indicators that the Audit Committee had. So as things are coming back on stream in the coming weeks, we will look to rebuild that, and we'll bring back to you what we can get, and where there are data, we'll have those discussions with you, Chair, around where we can go for alternatives to make sure that you are getting that broad sort of overview of how the council is performing across the range of services. But some of that data reconstruction work is happening now. I know most notably in housing, Ajman's teams are sort of very, very much over that and are sort of starting to reconstruct that, starting to build new data. So we'll have that in the coming weeks.
Great. Okay. Yeah. Well, I look forward to that. I think that's very important. Well, Ajman, since you're on, can you say how we are doing at the front line? I mean, it's one of the most sensitive services, particularly around housing repairs, for example. How are you kind of keeping an eye on what data is available to you, and what's it looking like in terms of delivery?
So the housing repairs.
Well, specifically, I mean, you've talked about debt and so on, and we've seem to have a reasonable handle on the income and expenditure. So I was thinking more about the actual service end of things, performance on the ground.
So I think on the ground, the ones that are mainly public facing, so housing, the repairs one obviously is one that we try to continue with. Since we had the first lockdown, we went back into providing all services, and now we've had to cut back and just do urgent and non-essential repairs. So we can track that in terms of numbers. The other big one that was of concern to me, and I wanted to make sure that we didn't fall down on, was the gas safety inspections. So we've got approaches that we develop where we can track and monitor the work that the team are doing and making sure that all gas safety inspections are kept up to date. So that's and voids performance. So we're beginning to get data in terms of voids, and we've got workarounds around that. And again, the team have been working to develop mechanisms to try and deal with rent arrears level. It's not the finished article yet, but they're all working on that. So some of those areas, ASB, those details we can provide and monitor and track. Things like on the sort of the community safety side has been affected in terms of getting all the data. That's not always necessarily up to date, so it's difficult to track those things. But where we can find workarounds, that's what we've done, and we're sort of keeping an eye on some of those areas and having regular feedback with staff.
Great, well, that's helpful. And so, I mean, that's a good example of Bruce, as we pick up data, I think it would be helpful. I certainly don't want to start creating extra work for officers, but I really just want to tap in as you collect data on management, that, as it were, we are in the loop of knowing where some of these top line things that Ajman and housing has just talked about, and things like cleansing would be another one. You know, just some sort of those top line ones, I think, just to include us in circulation would be helpful.
That's the plan. Some of those, as I said, they're coming. It's just, it will need a few more weeks in terms of getting those data runs for you, so that you're looking at something meaningful rather than just something that's non-comparable.
Okay, any other points on that before we move on back to the main agenda? I'm now on item 9, Treasury Management Update. And I mean, that goes along, I suppose, with 10, the review of the Treasury Management Strategy. Are you introducing Ian?
I was going to ask Pradeep to just give us an overview, but just to highlight the point you just made, really, Chair, which is, given where we are in the financial calendar, obviously we bring, as always, our regular Treasury Management update report to this meeting, which basically on as close to a quarterly basis as we can. But of course, we also are finalising and bring here the Treasury Management strategy for the next financial year, which goes as part of the main budget report, and which ultimately ends up at full council. So we give it a sort of an airing here as well. So it was just to reinforce that point. So I may suggest we take those two items almost as given as one, and then come back for questions if that works.
Yeah, no, that's what I was anticipating. Yep, thanks. So go ahead.
Yep. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Chair. So basically, so for this audit committee, we have two treasury reports for the committee. The first report is an update on treasury management activities carried during the first half of the financial year, which is basically from April to September, and that's Appendix 1. The second part is Appendix 2, which covers the third quarter of the financial year, which is October to December. The committee is requested, just to make a note of what happened during this period. Also to state the CFR numbers in the report, 21-22 to 23-24 are provisional ahead of the Feb's annual budget report, and they are subject to change. So just to make a note of that thing. Coming back to the Appendix 1. So the Appendix 1, like I said, is a half-yearly report, and just compares the investment balances we had at end of September to the opening balances in April. And it also compares the outstanding debt we had at end of September to the opening balances in April. What I've said is in the report is basically, if you look at the investments, the credit quality, we have maintained our investments between A+ and A, which is basically in line with the TMS for the council. So this is on the first half. The second part, which was the quarterly report on the October to December, it works with the same principle. It's a comparison between December and the opening balances in October. Same for the investments and borrowing. And also within this quarter, we have maintained our investment quality between A+ and A, which is, again, like I said, it's in line with the TMS what we agreed last year for this financial year. So this is the first report for the committee as an update. I can move on to the second one unless you have any specific questions on these ones.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I was just interested, given the PWLB interest rate rise and us looking for alternatives, how successful that strategy has been in terms of finding reasonably risk-free alternatives to the PWLB.
Yeah. So so basically, and that's all. And also, it's the same. So and that quite clearly moves to the next year's strategy. So what we've done in the next year's strategies, Chair, we haven't done any major changes. There are no major changes. All the management indicators are the same, because what we think the TMS last year was quite robust in terms of strategic and operational point, and there was no point of changing anything because the strategy worked really fine in the hard times last year. And like I say always, if there's any change in the strategy, obviously the committee will be notified before we do any changes, and that will be we will bring that to the board in the committee. Apart from that, the only change in the TMS from last year was the PWLB loans are no longer available to local authorities planning to buy investment assets primarily for yield. And in our capital programs, we are quite clear that there is no such thing, where we have anything we say is, we will be doing this capital program and it's purely for yield purposes. So our capital program is quite clear. We are quite clear on what the PWLB is looking for. So we are quite okay on that side.
Great. Okay. Anyone else got any questions about this? I mean, I had just a general point that this report is going to become more important to us. And if you look at the projection, there are two things happening: uncertainty in the market over interest rates, and we're now got 30,000 yield on interest rates, which is down from 177,000. That's just an indication of the degree of uncertainty. And the second issue that is really why this, I think, has got to go up our agenda going forward, is that our investment exposure over the next few years, and it's largely driven by housing, we run from £100 million expenditure to £300 million expenditure on housing, which exposes us both to more risk in this area and makes treasury management much more important. And it then goes back to our earlier thing about deep dive, making sure that we've got as good projections as possible over our spend, particularly in housing. But it is a very big increase. We're trebling the amount annual spending over the next 2 to 3 years. So it just, I guess, a note to all of us that this is not. This is no longer just a sort of routine report when things were pretty much stable. We're moving into a new era in all sorts of ways. Great. Okay. Thanks very much, Pradeep. I appreciate your efforts, and I think we're endorsing.
I've got a question.
Oh, you have. So I asked for them. Go ahead.
I have.
Yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to ask your view on Bitcoin investment, and if that's something to consider for the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Gregory. I think with the cryptos, especially like Bitcoins, these are purely we don't like, because if you look at the TMS, we are really focused on the safety of our money, especially when it comes to cryptos. And for me, it's like a bubble, it can burst anytime. So we wouldn't be going on that thing, and we are quite clear that we wouldn't be taking any sort of risk, with public's money on this thing. So it's good you mentioned it, but Bitcoin is totally off the table from my, so there's no chance here.
Jackie, you've got your hand up.
Yes, it's just very, very briefly, just going back on the point you raised, Chair, about the capital programme and the borrowing over the next couple of years. I think Pradeep emphasised that the figures in these reports were draft, and only today I've been going through some of those forecasts for next year with the finance teams that support those capital projects, and looking to challenge them as we agreed in line with the deep dive report. And I expect some of those areas will come down, particularly around housing, before they come forward in the budget report at the big end of the year.
Good warning. Thanks for that. But nonetheless, I think the basic point still stands that we're going to be much more exposed on risk for good reasons. We want to see more investment in this area, but it puts more emphasis on management, both of estimating and treasury management. Great stuff. Thanks very much. Then let's move on then to audit and anti-fraud. So is this Tracy? You're on mute if it is you.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. As you know, this is our regular update on the progress of audit and anti-fraud. I've got to put in a couple of caveats at the start of this, as was explained regarding the performance. We haven't got data relating to a number of our performance targets because that's held on Pentana and we can't access that as a result of the cyber attack. So that's been omitted. I did give you some data from the last report just so you could see what was there as of October. The other point to make is that from April till October, all of the auditors and most of the investigating officers were redeployed, and that's the case again since coming back after Christmas. So that will obviously impact on the work that we do. Having said that, we did revise our plan in October to take account of the reduced amount of time we had available, and also the availability of service managers and in the different directorates because of their impact at that point on from COVID. And of course, that's now been exacerbated by the cyber attack. So we had already reduced our plan down to 38 reviews. Since then, because of the cyber attack, we revisited the IT audits. We had 5 planned. 2 of those have been deferred till next year at the moment. But we have agreed with Rob to go ahead with the other 3 with the view they've been changed slightly in order to focus more on either the response to COVID or the effects of the cyber attack. So they're much more targeted around those 2 topics, but they're the same overall theme. We've also reduced 3 schools because Hackney Education said that for various reasons they weren't required at this time. So of the 33 reviews left, we have started 19 of those. 6 we've managed to finalize so far, and 2 are in draft report stage. So I still remain fairly hopeful that provided that there's the ability from services to assist in reviews, i.e. that they can access data that will help us with the reviews, because obviously if we can't get access to the data, it's going to be impossible for us to review the internal controls and provide any assurance. And also the cooperation, and I say that in the nicest possible way because I understand how much pressure all these services are under. But we do rely on them making time for us to undertake reviews as well. So those are the 2 caveats around it. I don't have anything else to say. I know Michael will probably give you a little bit of an update on where the fraud side of things have got to at this point, but I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
Any questions to Tracy before we ask Michael to come in? I mean, I just got a general point that I do think we ought to be championing the continuing of audit as a function. I mean, there are a couple of real risks here, and we've seen in the government's the complaints about the government scheme that HMRC have not been following up enormous numbers. I think there are several tens of thousands of complaints, and they've found only got 5,000 investigations going on. So clearly, this is a circumstance in which people are taking advantage of the situation. And then there's the added complication of people working away from their office. So we are vulnerable. So I do want to, while appreciating both the frontline staff not wanting a bloody audit as well as everything else, and equally you having less staff because they're being put on front line for all sorts of good reasons. Yeah. Nonetheless, I want to continue to see as much audit as possible, given those vulnerabilities. So,
well, I would assure you that we are doing. I mean, at the moment, the auditors, I've got 4 audit staff plus the IT auditors that are brought in separately, so the IT side won't be affected. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I was just looking.
The other 4 are only. I've released them 1 day a week to help with the grant verification because they did a lot of work on that before, and I'm very conscious of how important that is at the moment for our local business community. And it made sense to be using staff who understood the process. So they're only released 1 day a week, other than filling in if they have additional capacity because they've just got some downtime on audits, because obviously it's not as easy as it was before when we were in the building where you could just go off and do an audit for 3 days and it was done. Everybody's slotting in as and when. So they're very conscious of the need to try and get through the audits that we still have left on the plan. And that the other thing I should add, that we have done 3 additional things this year which we haven't done before, and that was at the request of Hackney Education. A number of the schools have applied for DOV grants, and they then needed to get certification for them. And some of them were looking to actually pay for that service externally with local accountants and things. And we offered to do it free of charge for them on the proviso that the money they saved, they reinvested in the education of those children that have been disadvantaged recently as a result of the lockdowns and things. So that was a sum of about £1,500 a school. So we have done that for them.
Great. That sounds a good initiative.
Yeah, which is a sort of added value to them, I suppose. I hope. So, yeah.
Good. Thanks very much, Tracy. I'm not seeing any people indicating. So, yeah, keep up the good work.
Thanks.
Yeah. Michael, do you want to come in on the fraud side?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just one thing to add on the audit side, some extra benefit that has also been added by the auditors, where we're needing to redesign processes and systems, particularly following the cyber attack. Auditors are being part of project teams to help look at risks at the early stage to make sure that we build back properly and hopefully prevent risks from materialising in the first instance. So it's just another piece of benefit that's being added there at the moment. Moving on to the fraud side, things are looking different there at the moment. The impact of COVID is that we are looking at different things to what we have historically done. I usually come to this meeting and I report back on exactly the same thing each time. We have moved away from a position of being completely reactive because of the volume of work that comes in to being more proactive and picking up particularly information coming from the National Fraud Initiative and working through some of that where we've not had the capacity to do so previously. So there's different fraud elements being picked up there. There's also elements specifically related to COVID, particularly the grants that the team are heavily involved in at the moment. And then we also have an issue on the cyber side in that some of the information that we would ordinarily refer to is not available to the team, which makes it difficult to carry out some of those inquiries. And that also impacts because there's quite a few instances where counter-fraud work has taken place, the investigation has been carried out, and when the results are passed back to the service team to act and implement, there's difficulties for them there in terms of making a final call on whether a service should be withdrawn, for example, or being able to check their own data. So there's a couple of things manifesting themselves there which mean that things are a little bit different to how I normally show to you. I'm going to put the report on screen just because I think it's a little bit easier to follow through the figures if you've got those there in front of you. So hopefully you can see that now. If someone could just give me a verbal cue back because I can't see any of you at the moment.
Yeah, they're there.
Okay, so this first table on the report sums up the reactive work. You'll see that there's significant drops in the number of tenancy fraud and parking referrals. So the overall number of reactive investigations coming into the team is half of what it was in the previous year, or getting on for half of. Now, while those numbers are down, we also have the fraud inquiries. So that's where other councils, the police, different forces ask us to check our records to help them with their investigations. They're significantly down. That's largely down to a reduction in inquiries from DWP. If we then move on to the National Fraud Initiative, which is the proactive element of the work that the teams are undertaking at the moment, you'll hopefully be able to pick out from that that there's large increases in what has been reviewed on the current NFI compared to the previous NFI. So in particular, I would highlight the housing waiting list, where roughly 450 matches have now been reviewed. We have council tax reduction scheme, where we've done a lot more work than previously, and also 937 COVID grants that have been reviewed by the investigators up to the end of December, and that work's now picking up at pace again. We've reviewed more than 100 already this week of the newer applications that have come in. So that's how what we're looking at has changed. In terms of the outcomes from that work, the things to highlight, so first of all, the council service or discount cancelled. That's the no recourse to public funds work. You'll see that there's only 3 being reported here, whereas there were 3 new ones for the last quarter, whereas the first 2 quarters of the year there were 50 cancellations. That work has been continuing roughly in the same sorts of volumes as it always has been, but because of issues with the Mosaic system for social care, we're unable to actually confirm the outcomes of the investigations at this point. So they're not showing on here, but that's not to say that there won't be results that materialise in a later period as a result of work done in the last quarter. The COVID business grants is obviously a new area of work since the pandemic started. Each one of those grants that we prevent being paid has a value of at least £10,000. And that is money that we stop going out the door rather than have to deal with after the event. And in the last week, like I say, more than 100 new applications have been reviewed. 5 of those, there's stops on an additional 5 grants as at this point in time. Some of those might later be released, but at the moment, that's what's happened this week. You'll remember that the Blue Badge parking work, the numbers were significantly down on that, but that doesn't actually carry through to the outcomes from that work. While the number of PCNs issued is down on the previous year, in all other areas we're actually up on those results. So partly that sometimes it makes things easier to deal with. If the volumes are down, it's easier to prioritise and deal with things and take a fuller look at something than it's otherwise able to do so. Moving on to the tenancy outcomes at the bottom of that table, this is where we're suffering at the moment in terms of being able to investigate and get tenancies back. That's at a far reduced scale at the moment. There's only 2 in the last quarter, so it's not impossible, but it's nowhere near what we were achieving a year ago. That's largely because we can't get out and into people's homes, which is an important element of that work. Now, the silver lining on the tenancy side is that we have put a lot of resource into looking at the housing applications that have flagged through the National Fraud Initiative, and we're already at a stage where twice as many of those have been cancelled as they had in the whole of last year. And there's also a significant further number that are pending review by the waiting list team. They don't have the systems available at the moment to make a final call on those applications, but I anticipate that there will be a sizable number of additional cancellations on the basis of work that's been carried out over recent months. So that's where we're at the moment. So you can see that what we're looking at has changed. The outcomes have changed, but there's a lot of work still going on behind the scenes, and the teams have been adaptable to look at new things, and that's in addition to people that have been out supporting other areas of the council that need support at the moment. So I'll pause and take any questions.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Michael. Very good report. Anna, you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Michael. This is most fascinating. All this fraud that goes on. I don't think members are aware, particularly around housing. And I just think that what's going on with our sort of need to review some of our housing needs stuff, I think this is quite useful information, I think, for our members, really, because I think it would help. I'm just thinking what we can do politically to help this message, that because obviously, the fraud that goes on is money that's not being used for where it's needed, isn't it, really? And I just want
we have been making consistently, Anna.
I know, but people don't like. No, I'll be honest, Nick. Though, but people are very like, oh no, everyone's really not, But actually, there are some, obviously, it's quite unpleasant to know that people have tried to make money out of what's happened here and applied for grants in a deceptive way, potentially, and all other sources of potential income revenue that they can get from the council. That it's people's taxes at the end of the day, isn't it? It's not. It's not good, because it's money when we're having to make difficult decisions.
you know.
Can I just
Thank you, Michael. Anyway.
thank you. Can I just I don't want to mislead anyone. Because of my job title, I say the word fraud maybe more than I should do. Where we have people subletting their homes, obviously that is not acceptable. It's criminal act, no two ways about it. Where we identify that cases on the waiting list are for cancellation, that can be for a number of reasons. It could be because people have misrepresented themselves to Hackney. But quite a lot of what we find from the National Fraud Initiative is where a waiting list application in Hackney has been matched to, for example, a waiting list application made in another authority or a housing benefit application in another authority. So it could be in that case that someone is chancing their arm and putting two applications in when they shouldn't be. But equally, it could be that someone has just moved on from Hackney and not bothered to tell us. So you'll appreciate there's a distinction there. It's similar with the no recourse to public funds. While we need to protect the council's money, it's also true that client group are in difficult circumstances, and I think we need to take a careful view about people in that sort of position that may feel that they have no alternative. While it doesn't necessarily make a representation right, it means that we need to be maybe sympathetic to some of the circumstances that sit behind that.
You always have been, Michael. I think that's exactly the right attitude. But there are some areas, and Anna's right, like trying to sell off your council house. I think is an absolutely egregious thing. It takes away for private profit an opportunity for us. So I've always been very keen we see the numbers there. Okay, great. Shall we move on? Just very conscious of the time. I don't want to take advantage of people, given we've been on this for 3 hours now, 3.5 hours. Great. And we move on then, if there's no questions on Michael's, further questions on Michael's report, to the review of the Audit Committee's terms of reference. And I'm not sure who's introducing this.
If I may, Chair.
I'll be very patient. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And thank you for having this document this evening to talk about this. Members will be aware that we have recently initiated a second phase of the Constitution Review, having conducted an initial phase in spring 2020 and completed that. As one of the tranches of this Constitution Review, we identified committee terms of reference as an area for consideration. We met with the member reference group just before Christmas, I believe, to talk about some of the core principles around that review of terms of reference. I have set those out in the report, and I'm not proposing to go through them line by line at this stage. Following that, we met with the committee chair and key officers that support the Audit Committee to review the pre-existing SIPFA practical guidance for audit committees, and we've included that as Appendix 1 in the report. We have subsequently identified a number of revisions which are marked as track changes on Appendix 2. So primarily the reason we're here this evening is to invite the committee to review those proposed amendments and then consider any other changes they may deem necessary. We will refer those comments back to the CRG if required, assuming that the committee is broadly happy with the proposed changes to terms of reference. We will be referring this to Council in May 2021. Just to identify a couple of areas where we have made changes, it's primarily about language, and I think it's fair to say most of it is relatively minor amendments to language, just to ensure that we've got something that's a bit more robust and reflects the current landscape in terms of how audit committees operate across different local authorities. That's my introduction to the report. Obviously happy to take any questions as required.
Great, thanks very much, Andrew. Yeah, as you said, we had a good session to go through it. I think the major substantive issue that we brought up was the Constitution currently says the Audit Committee reports to the Corporate Committee. And what we wanted to do in line with the SIPFA guidance is to make it absolutely clear that it was a council committee and that we had an obligation to report annually to the council on our performance. That's very much part of the SIPFA thing, and that's you've put in as one of the key recommendations. Right, Michelle, you wanted a point.
Yes, just towards the end of the track changes document, you put in place effective working relationships with the Standards Committee. So what does that actually entail? I mean, we don't really connect much with the Standards Committee. So how do you see that working? Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Gregory. I think primarily following discussions with the chair, there was some recognition that there is a role in respect to audit and standards working in a collaborative fashion. I think at the same time, we would highlight that SIPFA guidance also makes it very clear that there shouldn't be a duplication of roles. So although the Standards Committee will retain a fairly robust and independent function to that of the Audit Committee, I think the view was that there would be some benefit, I think, in terms of ensuring that if there were common issues that were arising in either of the committees, the chairs were in a position to work together and work in a collaborative fashion. I would say that the wording we've chosen is one that's designed to be flexible rather than be prescriptive about how that relationship works. And I think particularly the chair was keen that we had something that captured that both in respect to scrutiny and standards.
Yep, no, I think that summarizes it nicely, Andrew. I mean, the concern was we have to sign off an overall governance statement, and Standards Committee has obviously got a particular concern about an aspect of that governance. So there has to be, in my view, some overlap, as Andrew's saying, between the two, so that we are able to sign off an overall governance for the council, a governance statement for the council. Great. Any other, Anna? Is that a memorial? Right. So I'm taking that if there are no other questions, we can approve this and go forward on the point that Andrew's discussed, that we then move and hopefully can get this all in place for the May annual meeting. Great. Thanks very much, Andrew. Thanks for your patience. Right, we now move on to another person who's been very patient, which is to update us on the external audit. A less happy story, I think. Ian, are you going to start this, or will we go straight to Lucy?
I think, just mindful of the time, Chair, and sort of very quickly then, I think obviously this committee has been kept abreast of the work the teams have been doing to get the accounts closed, which we did, ahead of the timetable. And then obviously that commenced the work in relation to the audit, which we were making good progress. As committee was notified back in September, there were a couple of items that were not in our gift to resolve. So I would say things like the position on dedicated schools grant, the position on the way that the liabilities that we hold in relation to the London Pension Fund Authority interact with our accounts. All factors which, my view on it, Chair, I think were always going to be resolvable, but for reasons that exist in the world of the FRC's requirements, the auditors were unable to sign it off. And at that meeting also, it's fair to say our value for money conclusion, whilst not signed off, was deemed appropriate. Obviously, since that meeting, we've had the 13th or 11th of October event, and that's continued to cause issues, which Lucy will come on to outline in a moment. But I think, my view, I'm very disappointed to be sitting here tonight without the accounts signed off. I can accept with the cyber attack just about the VFM conclusion not being agreed, but it is not a position I'm happy with, that the audit team haven't managed to secure the accounts signed off by Christmas, which is what we agreed when we met with you early in December. But I'll let Lucy update you on that.
Thank you. And to share Ian's disappointment and frustration that we are not at a point that we can sign off the accounts. And just to kind of elaborate on that, in late December, after we'd spoken to the chair, it was identified that a key part of our IT general controls work hadn't been completed, and that work has to be completed in order for us to be able to sign off the accounts. So we're working on that. I've got IT auditors are working with the Hackney IT audit team at the moment to complete that work as quickly as possible. Our IT audit team are very aware of the circumstances in which you're in, which the Hackney IT team is in, and they're working very closely to understand what we can and cannot access, and where there are workarounds if possible. As Ian pointed out, we've after consultation taken the view that we're unable to sign the VFM conclusion until our IT audit team have performed work on the systems once they are restored and working again. And as I said, in September, none of the work that we've done on value for money to date has indicated that there is an issue with the value for money arrangements at the council. It's just until we can do that additional work around the IT audit work, around how the systems have been recovered, what processes were in place for recovery, we feel that we cannot sign off to say that value for money conclusion is clean. So again, we're working with the council finance team and the IT team, and as soon as we're able to do that work, we will do that and sign off the value for money conclusion.
Can I just stop you there, Lucy? I'm just because I share Ian's dismay that I was reassured at the beginning of December that things were in place. And suddenly, not having reassured the committee and the rest of the council that we were on track, then I suddenly get this, and I'm just not absolutely clear what has changed, because the IT attack was some time before, and we knew about the value for money issue. What happened between the beginning of December and the report that you're giving now?
So as part of our work, we have to do work on IT general controls, which essentially give us assurance that the information we're taking from nominal ledger reports is correct, that there's enough control around that system to make sure that people aren't accessing it and putting in malicious entries, which would affect the accounts. This work hadn't been done properly. And without that work, I can't document that I have that assurance that the ledger was operating as intended, and therefore that all the reports we've taken from that system are correct.
So it should have been done before. This was
done before. Should have been done for complete oversight that it hadn't been done. A full root cause analysis is being performed to understand how we've got to this position. It's completely unacceptable. And we're, as I say, we are working as quickly and as hard as we can to resolve that.
And what's your prognosis?
I know that our IT audit director is catching up with the IT audit team tomorrow to go through the bits of information that we have and the areas that we don't have, where we've talked about quite a few times tonight, systems access is unavailable, and then to see if there are workarounds around that.
So no timing that you can put on any of that?
As soon as possible is the best I can give you, I'm afraid.
Well,
Lucy,
isn't it?
If I may just ask a further question, just for clarity, because I think the committee needs to be aware of it. We're not the only council who've been notified that you haven't undertaken this work, are we?
No, you're not.
So it's just, again, for clarity to members here, that this is a major piece of the audit work, the auditors, and I'm sorry to put it in these terms, Lucy, but that the team just missed, or I think the way you described it just was maybe even started it but didn't do it satisfactorily. I don't, which one is it? Is it that, or is it they just didn't do it?
There's two parts of work. There was miscommunication. Part A was done, part B wasn't. So it wasn't completed satisfactorily.
So I suppose picking up on Councillor Sharman's point, and this is why I want to just clarify the fact that we're not the only council in the sort of Mazars London suite who haven't had this piece of work done. Can you assure us will be prioritised?
Yeah, I've put in IT
Given
auditors to ensure
commitments have been made previously.
Yeah, the work is being done quickly and efficiently. IT auditors know exactly what they're looking for.
Just to be clear, my point, sorry to interrupt, is I would expect Hackney to be pushed to the top of the queue as opposed to the other councils, given the work we've done with you so far and the extent to which we've engaged over the years, and that would be what I'm sure Councillor Sharma would also expect.
I certainly do. I mean, I'm deeply disappointed because we'd established a good relationship. I felt things were really going in the right direction. And it's been one thing after another, frankly, over the last, some of them in your control, some of them not. So I understand some of the difficulties, but my confidence has been shaken. And I do think you need to show us that you really are on our side, as it were, in terms of ensuring that our accounts and our position is as it should be.
Yeah, work is being prioritised. Yeah.
Well, can you let me know and give me a better estimate of when this might be resolved than you've been able to give me tonight, as soon as possible? I mean, not even knowing when it might be resolved is really very unsatisfactory, even an estimate. Okay, other members want to come in on what's clearly an unsatisfactory point? Yes,
Yes.
Harvey.
Oh.
Yeah, Michelle, and then, well, Harvey was up first, and then Michelle.
I just want to say that what Ian said, that he and Councillor Sharman are disappointed. I mean, I certainly am extremely disappointed, and I would hope, I speak the whole committee, that we all expect that we are put to the top of the list in view of what Ian said.
Yeah.
It's not acceptable. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well said.
It's happened. And the fact that there is a possibility that we're not being prioritised is, in my view, unacceptable.
Thank you, Harvey. Michelle.
What are the implications of the audited accounts not being ready on time? Do we not usually have them for the February full council? So what are the implications to Hackney?
Unfortunately, this is a situation that's all too common in local government, actually. And some people have not signed off their 18-19 accounts. Is that true, Ian? I don't know.
It certainly was the case. There have been a few that hadn't been that relatively recently were some of our near neighbours. But I wouldn't be surprised if there will always be the odd one that hasn't. I think I'm actually right in saying someone hasn't even had their audit started for last financial year yet as well. They're not in.
So there are no direct implications, Michelle, as I understand it. Perhaps Ian, you can fill in on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, if the accounts aren't signed, what ultimately happens is the audit certificate is issued, and if there are no objections outstanding, then what Lucy can do is then issue effectively closes the accounts formally, don't you? So it's not possible for an objector to raise issues, and actually then we can move on. So effectively you can't then go back and reopen the books once that certificate's closed. Now, it's not uncommon for councils to have years of accounts open even if they've been audited, because if someone makes an objection, that can run in some cases for many, many years. It wasn't that long ago. I can remember sort of starting this role 10, 12 years ago when we had a number of years of accounts open, albeit they'd been audited because we had an objection about, I think it was a parking issue previously. Obviously, we're dealing with an objection in relation to a PFI position at the moment that means our accounts aren't certificated yet, for want of a better word.
Great. Thanks, Ian. Harvey, you want to come back?
Yeah, I was just going to say, whilst there might not be any direct sanctions or such like, there is certainly reputational damage. At the moment, it's 1 year. We don't want it to go further. We do not want to find ourselves in an EU situation.
No, thank you. I totally agree with that. I mean, we ought to be now moving into planning for the next year's or the current year's audit, which after all is only 3 months away. So I think some reassurance on the point that Harvey's been making would be helpful. Okay, well, rather than digging away at this, but I think you've registered the committee's view. Great. Okay. We now move on to the final item, which is the work programme, which, unless I'm hearing any concerns about they're getting on for 4 hours, but I think it's really chunky issues, and we're at a key time. So I don't apologise for going on. I think we've done an excellent job going through some of the very big issues that are confronting the council. But my thanks for everyone for staying with it. Harvey, you wanted to
just a minor logistical point to add to the issue of bringing back page numbering, is that where we have verbal reports, the items within the agenda body should agree with the items, the numbers in the contents, and not just miss out. I mean, I think it was item 14 or something was a verbal report. So then item 15 on the list became item 14 in the report itself, which is very confusing.
Right.
I'm not sure which one. Yeah, numbers should marry up.
Yeah.
Makes it easier to go through.
Okay, thanks very much. Right, well, people, go and enjoy the rest of the evening, such as it is, and thanks again for all your help and support.